Furyu is a publisher I've always had a bit of a spotty history with. Alliance Alive is a game I find genuinely very charming, whilst on the other hand, I'm really not fond of the Caligula effect. Any of them. Which is why when Monark was first released, I was very surprised at just how much it caught my eye. I'm not sure whether it was the fact that it was being developed by Lancas, a developer who'd previously worked on several SMT games, or the fact that the game was reportedly inspired by Shin Megami Tensei If, a game that, while I've not played, I'm very much aware of the subject matter, and I'm very curious how a game with modern production values would handle such a thing. Or maybe it's just the fact that Baby Kraft was exposed to a lot of 90s edge when he was very, very young, and the colour scheme of black, red and white is pretty much ingrained in this eternal edgy 13-year-old brain of mine, with Monarch's key and promotional art really feeling like it was targeting me directly. It was probably that one. Which caused me to have an unusual urge to play it, much like previous games on this channel. Nonetheless, Monarch is a game that I have now played thanks to a very gracious review code provided by NIS America. Seriously, thank you kindly. Mwah. And now, after playing it for about 25 hours or so, I want to give you my general thoughts on the game. I would do a full review, but between work and that SMT video that's taking me forever, I'll get it by the end of February, guys, honest. And wanting to get something out for the embargo, these first impressions will have to do, at least for now. Granted, I do think I have enough info for a general buyer's guide regardless. So, starting with the game's general premise, the SMT If inspiration becomes instantly apparent. The game begins with an ordinary day at school being interrupted by a barrier suddenly appearing around it, as well as a mysterious mist forming in various locations on campus, causing the students to break down and go insane. After naming our protagonist, we are given a quick psych test in a dream to determine what sins we are guilty of, and by how much at that. After that, we wake up passed out on the floor, being awoken by the school's doctor, the student council president, and our younger sister, who all ventured into the mist to try and save us. Naturally, being a good silent protagonist, we now can't remember a single thing. Regardless, we do know enough that the mist is dangerous, so we all huff it out of there. In the process of which, our sister receives a phone call that drags all of our asses into another world, seemingly one where demons reside. To protect ourselves and everyone else, we make a pact with a bunny-like demon named Vanitas to acquire some anime gear to fight back. After we escape, we have a minor confrontation with a post-time skip Rosyu from Gurren Lagann, and then we are pulled aside by the school's dean, who explains exactly what's going on. Essentially, the mist is being spread by 7 pact bearers who have all made pacts with demons based on the 7 deadly sins, us not included. These pacts will give the humans some sort of power, however, using said power in the real world will cause the mist to spread. So it's up to us to hop into the other world and start smashing anything that looks big and shiny to void their contracts and take their powers away, whilst also putting them in a coma, but that's okay I guess. To do this, we have several demons that we can command over, as well as teaming up with other students that we can give powers, and in some cases, make some uneasy alliances with other pact bearers. To access the other world so we can shatter the pact bearers' ideals, these things, you've got to venture into the mist to find a collection of phones that you can use as a portal. During these sections, there's usually a few puzzles or so that need to be dealt with, most of which aren't particularly involved, but sometimes have fairly inventive means of solving, at least within the game's limited scope. Most of the time making good use of the student handbook and library files that you have on your phone. All while doing this, however, your madness meter will slowly fill up, and once it reaches 100%, you'll go insane and get walked back to the nurse's office. Something that's not really that much of a setback, since it takes about 30 seconds to fast travel back to the dungeon you were in and run to where you were, making it seem kinda like a pointless mechanic, but at the very least it does serve another purpose in the game, which we'll get to in a sec. One negative thing I will say about these quote-unquote dungeons is that, unfortunately, due to the setting, a lot of them, particularly early on, are just variations of school hallways, so I hope you like the opening to Persona 1. Once you enter the otherworld, this is where the battles begin, and Monarch is a tactical RPG that uses a radius-based combat system, Think something like Phantom Brave, albeit a little less complex. Each player phase you can position yourself and take an action, be it arts, which are physical skills that cost HP, authorities, that are magic skills that will increase your madness, or items, which are, well, they're items. There is, however, also the ability to defer, which will let you give one of your units who have already done something this turn the ability to move and act again at the cost of some of their madness going up, just like with authorities. Essentially, in Monark, every unit's a Fire Emblem dancer. Speaking of madness, however, this is one of the two meters that are kind of the main gimmick of Monark's gameplay, being the madness and the awakening gauge. Firstly, the awakening gauge is pretty simple. It starts at 0 at the beginning of every fight, and every time you take damage or use the resolve ability, it will slowly increase. And once it hits 100%, you will go into awakening mode, which will give you a buff to all of your stats, as well as give you a special move providing you've unlocked it. When the madness gauge reaches 100%, unlike in the school where you'll be sent straight back to the nurse's office, in battle you will go into a berserk-like state. This will also give you a boost to all of your stats, excluding defense. However, this also means that you can't control them, which means they'll attack friend or foe with some of their strongest moves that they have, and after 3 turns will essentially explode, killing themselves and damaging everybody around them. There is also a third state that you can enter called Enlightened, which is gained by filling out both the Madness and the Awakening gauges. Doing this will give you the benefits of Madness and Awakening at the same time without any of the downsides of Madness, as well as giving you an even stronger super move, providing you have it. It's a fun system, however it does have a few quirks to it that I'm not particularly fond of. While I like the idea of this risk-reward system, unfortunately there's too much RNG involved in it for my liking. The main problem is that going into Awakening mode unfortunately reduces your madness down to 0 and keeps it there no matter what. Meaning to go into this Enlightened stage, you need to get your madness to 100% first and then become Awoken. The problem is even if you can get your Awakening to 99%, there is no way to actually guarantee that the character, after going mad, will do something to cause that awakening gauge to go up. I had several occasions where even under-leveled, my protagonist was one-shotting certain enemies, meaning that he'd never get counter-hit, which would mean that he wouldn't be able to raise his awakening gauge to enlighten him, and then he'd just be a sitting duck for the rest of the match, or he would survive, but would die after 3 turns, which is a problem because if the protagonist dies, then it's game over. I appreciate the system being this risk-reward style thing, but I don't enjoy just how random it can be at times. Other than that, everything about the battle system, while simple, is pretty decent still. The attacks and spells that you have all the sort of common effects that you might assume that they'd have, like damage, poison, poison plus damage, disable, hit an area of enemies opposed to just a single. And there's also stuff like allies assisting you with a basic attack if they're within range, meaning that the positioning really matters. And stuff like the main character's resonance ability that allows you to essentially copy either an ally or an enemy's buffs, both onto yourself and from yourself onto them, allows for some interesting gameplay situations. It is at the very least a fairly competent tactical RPG, with the only stuff that I don't like is the mentioned RNG to the madness system, and the fact that the game doesn't scale its difficulty very well with how much you progress in power as you go through it, unfortunately resulting in the need to grind every now and then. One thing that I did really appreciate about the game's battle system is that when you are actually at the right level, the battles themselves are pretty easy. To get through them, you're still going to have to probably try, but if you're experienced with any sort of tactical RPG in the past, then you're not actually going to lose, I don't think. But the game has a ranking system for each mission, and you will be rewarded more spirit for higher rankings. And while beating the mission itself is pretty easy, getting that A or S rank on them can be quite tricky and actually requires you to use the game's mechanics to do so. how Monark ties the leveling system to the skill tree in the game. After each battle, you will acquire Spirit that is both your currency for items, but also your currency to unlock new skills on the skill tree. Characters will only level up when unlocking or upgrading a skill on said skill tree. This creates a fairly interesting dynamic for the player, as you have to decide between either unlocking brand new skills that you could use in battle, or maybe going back and buying some of the earlier skills that you skipped out on, or upgrading some of the ones that you already have because they're cheaper and you'd get more level ups out of it. It at the very least forces you to expand your skill set, meaning that you can't just rely on min-maxing one thing and making it really good. You have to give yourself a fairly diverse arsenal to work with. Something else that's kind of more weird than it is interesting is that while equipment is in the game, it's only usable by the legions, the demons that you control, and not by the human party members. These consist of a headpiece, a chest piece, and a leg piece which all upgrade certain stats and will sometimes, depending on the gear, give your legion an ability that they wouldn't otherwise have. It's pretty basic, but what it does do is change them cosmetically, which is really nice because the legions are all fairly basic looking skeleton people, and the different vestals that you could equip to them do end up making them look pretty different as you go throughout the game, which does give them a little bit more personality and charm than just being the blank slates that the normal enemies that you fight against look like too. The other way to increase your team stats are via alter egos, which will appear somewhere within the academy whenever you speak to certain NPCs. These will only activate depending on how sinful you are in certain areas. Upon doing so, however, it will unredact some of the areas of the NPC's profile, as well as give you some sort of minor stat boost to all of your characters. And speaking of those sin stats, that's something that I think the game does a really good job of kind of pushing, even though I'm not fully sure what they do yet. There does seem to be a few bits of dialogue that do change depending on where you're leaning though. The game does like throwing psych tests at you, and let me tell you, if you've got that same trashy part of your brain that makes you love personality quizzes or stuff that tells you what Ed, and Eddie character are you, then let me tell you, you've got a lot of stuff in here for you. I'd like a second opinion, please. I don't want to be double D. These are all pretty much optional, and you can still get these stats up by grinding out fights, as enemies will drop a little bit, but regardless, I still think they're a really fun part of the game. Moving on to the story and characters, I think this is a part of the game where Monark has some really interesting stuff going on, but really fumbles in the execution. For starters, the game is fairly slow paced, partly due to the fact of the level grinding that's needed to get through some of the bits, but you kind of do the same thing over and over, at least for Act 1, whereas in the 25 hours that I've played, I have kind of done the same thing 4 different times, just with 4 different pack bearers. And while I can't confirm this since I haven't experienced it myself, apparently the game does later on pull a Bravely Default, if you know what I mean, and the game kind of uses this as an excuse to get your levels up. Outside of all of this, I think that the seeds that the game's plot is planting and the sort of themes it's talking about are pretty good. However, I just think the way that it's handled is kind of awful in a lot of ways. The events of what's actually taking place a lot of the time is genuinely quite horrifying. However, none of the characters really react to the world around them in a way that you'd expect. I think moments of brevity within a grimdark story are very important, as they act as like a sort of palate cleanser so everything keeps hitting you hard. But in Monarch, it feels like sometimes the things that are happening might not actually be happening due to the way that the characters are reacting. You'll see a teacher and a bunch of students jump off of the roof, and you just carry on going without even acknowledging that fact. Or you'll hear about a student who's going around setting fire to a bunch of other students, and the general response is, "Oh boy, that means I'll get picked for the baseball team." It feels like the entire cast, NPCs and main characters included, don't really have a grasp on reality, which might be intentional, I don't know, but it definitely feels really weird and out of place. That being said, I do like the main cast. They're all pretty enjoyable and likable, and while there isn't much going on in terms of like inter-party dialogue outside of just standing around the main hub area and letting them converse with each other, I do like what is there, and I think each character is fairly interesting individually. Besides maybe Nozomi, she's nice and all, but she's very vanilla. The villains, on the other hand, are a bit of a mixed bag. I think some of them are pretty good, showing their motivations, and like you can look at them and say, yeah, you're definitely a bad person, but I can understand how you got here. Whilst other characters are just kind of unlikable, and that's kind of all they are, but alas. Finally, just quickly talking about the game's presentation before wrapping everything up, I will say Monark definitely feels like a Vita game. In fact, while I was playing it, my first thought was that, man, this game kind of feels like Lost Dimension, in the sense of you can kind of feel how small its scope is and how it's not really pushing to do anything big, and while that's fine, it's certainly not very impressive. What's funny is that after saying that to myself, I then realised that Lankhart had also made Lost Dimension, so that comparison fits pretty well. What I mean by all of this, though, is that areas in general are pretty basic and bland looking. They're also very flat and not particularly detailed or interesting. Character models are fairly basic and are not very representative of the actual character art in the portraits. There's a lot of disparity between them. Some of them are pretty good, like the Doctors and Kokoros fit their character art pretty well, but then you've got Ryotaro Delinquent Boy over here, who most of the time looks very baby-faced. Bright side to all of this is that it's not really that demanding, so it doesn't really matter if you get the slightly fuzzier looking version on Switch, or if you get the PS5 version where you can kind of see the model creases in characters' mouths. You're pretty much going to get the same visual style and look no matter what. From a quick boot up of the demo on Switch, it also seems to be running at 60 on there as well, so that's pretty good. Something I love about the game's presentation though is its music. There's not an awful lot of actual tracks in there, but when they use their unique tracks, they use them well. Essentially, all 7 of the Sins have their own boss track, and they're essentially just a lyricked song from an actual album. And when these songs kick in during their boss fights, they kind of feel like in an anime where the opening theme starts playing in the final battle. Due to the nature that it's technically licensed music, I don't think I can just play a little bit for you, but I will leave some sort of a link or something down in the description that you can copy and paste into the YouTube search bar if you want to listen to some of my favourites that I got to hear, because some of these tracks are absolute bangers. All in all, I think Monarch is pretty good despite a lot of obvious flaws. It's hard to judge for definite though, because it definitely feels like a slow burn, and depending on whether they're able to perfectly land the ending or not is what would determine whether I'd definitely recommend this or not. However, how a lot of the writing is handled and the general tonal dissonance that exists in Act 1, I'm not confident that that ending is going to be landed well, or at least as perfectly as it needs to be. The game's worst sin is definitely just how long in general it's drawn out between its slow pacing and its grinding. However, I will say that the 25 hours I spent with it didn't feel like 25 hours. It felt more like 15-20. I think if you're a fan of something like Disgaea, there's a lot less grinding in this compared to that. Granted, that's kind of Disgaea's main draw, but I still think that a lot of the tedium that this game might have for you really depends on the kind of person you are, or just how much time you have on you. Something that I think is pretty important to mention, and will hopefully reduce the tedium of the grinding a bit, is the game's easy mode isn't actually that much of a modifier. It doesn't actually reduce the amount of damage that you deal to the enemy, it just reduces the damage that you take. So something I might suggest is playing through the game on its quote-unquote easy mode, but just being a little bit underleveled for most of it. If nothing else, it will reduce any of the major grinding sessions that you might have to go through. There's some genuinely interesting stuff in Monark, but I do think that ultimately that time commitment is what stops it from being a easy recommend. I think at the very least that you should give the demo a shot and see how you feel from there. That demo definitely has some meat on its bones, and while the combat isn't very representative of the rest of the game, since it's all of the tutorial combat, but I do think that the writing and pacing is a very good indicator for what's to come later on. So if that's what was putting you off the game in the demo, then that's definitely something to be wary of. But if it was just the combat that you were worried about, then do know that, yeah, it definitely gets more involved and interesting as you go. But that's just about everything. I've gotta say, I'm actually really surprised that this video ended up being around about 20 minutes, because the last time I did something like this, it only ended up coming out at 9 minutes, so yeah, I think I've gotten better at actually talking about points, which is definitely cool. If you're a fan of JRPGs or just Japanese action games and such in general, then maybe give some of my other videos on my channel a watch. Most of my content is more scripted style stuff, where I try and make the video a bit more entertaining than just a dry buyer's guide, which I tried to kind of do here as well. However, this wasn't scripted at all really, other than just some notes that I gave myself, so do keep that in mind. Why don't you give that subscribe button a little click, because I really want to hit 1,000 subscribers and see if I can actually get a YouTube partnership and get monetized, because that would be pretty swell. I've put a lot of work into this channel over the last year or so, and being so close to that goal that I gave myself when I set out is something that I desperately want to try and get to. So yeah, if you would, that would be super cool. We should have SMT5's big review come out by the end of the month, hopefully. I mean, it's a big review, so I don't know if I'll manage to get it out quite on time. And then after that, I've got something Persona 4 Arena related coming up. And then after that, we're kind of in the unknown, but I definitely want to take a bit of a break from SMT, so we'll probably be mixing around with maybe some Falcom stuff. But until then, I'll see you all next time, guys. Bye.